1947, a sweltering night in Orlando. A skinny teenager sits at a scuffed piano under hot stage lights, fingers hovering above the keys. His name is Ray Charles Robinson, though the audience only knows him as that blind kid who's come to audition. He can't see the skeptical glances being exchanged in the darkened hall, but he can hear them, the murmur of doubts, a snicker from one of the seasoned horn players sizing him up. The bandleader, the famously hard, to please Lucky Millinder, lounges in a chair with a cigar waiting. Ray swallows hard, heart rattling in his chest, and begins to play. He pours every ounce of feeling into the piano, voice trembling with raw soul beyond his years. For a few minutes, the whispers hush. A couple of the musicians even stop smirking. When the last note fades, Ray sits expectantly in silence. Millinder lets out a long, disinterested sigh. "Ain't good enough, kid? You don't got what it takes," he says flatly. The words land like a punch to the gut. A hot flush of shame crawls up Ray's neck as quiet laughter titters in the corner of the stage. No one had ever dismissed him so cruelly before. He forces a nod, fights to keep his composure, and fumbles off the stage. In the empty alley behind the club, 16th year, old Ray Charles breaks down and weeps. He can still hear the band inside, already moving on without him. To them, he was just a blind boy who dared to dream above his station, a novelty act at best, a joke at worst. They thought the matter was settled then and there, that the kid from nowhere would slink back into obscurity. They were wrong. Ray Charles would remember that night as the first time the world slapped him in the face. He returned to his shabby room at a cheap boarding house, defeated and heartbroken. But as the hours passed and the sting of humiliation simmered into resolve, he made himself a quiet promise. Nobody would ever tell him he wasn't good enough again. The blind teenager resolved to practice harder than ever, to sharpen every skill he had, to prove that he belonged on any stage. In time, the name, Lucky Millinder, would fade into footnotes, and that dismissed blind boy would transform music itself. But on that night in 1947, all of that was still unimaginable. Ray was just an unknown young black pianist with trembling hands and red eyes, clutching his piano for support in the dark. He had faced public doubt and tasted private suffering, and it hurt more than anything since the day he lost his sight. What Ray couldn't know was that this pain would become fuel. The world had laughed at the blind boy, but the blind boy was about to teach the world to listen. And the sound he would create, a sound no one had yet even imagined, would make that laughter choke on its own echo. A childhood of silence and sound. Years earlier, in the tin-roofed poverty of rural North Florida, little Ray Charles Robinson's world had already gone dark. He wasn't born blind. He had seen enough to have memories painted in color, green pine trees against a blue sky, the brown eyes of his baby brother gazing up at him. Those images would haunt and guide him. When Ray was 5, he and his younger brother George were playing by their mother's wash tub, a wooden half, barrel filled with soapy water. George, barely 4, slipped and tumbled into the tub. For a moment, Ray laughed, thinking his brother was clowning around, until he heard splashing that didn't sound like play. Ray reached out, confused, and his fingertips brushed frantically at water. By the time he realized George was drowning, it was too late. Their mother, Aretha, came running at his screams. But George's tiny body had already gone limp in the water. Ray stood frozen in shock as his mother pulled his brother's lifeless form from the tub. The scene seared itself into Ray's young mind, the last thing he would ever see clearly in his life. In the months that followed, Ray's vision began to blur and dim, mysterious pain and discharge afflicting his eyes until day by day the world closed in on him. By age 7, Ray Charles Robinson was completely blind. Darkness had become his permanent reality, arriving hand in hand with grief. The two great tragedies of Ray's childhood, witnessing his beloved brother's death and losing his sight soon after, could have broken him entirely. And for a time, the boy was inconsolable, waking up screaming from nightmares of drowning and endless night. But Ray's mother, Aretha, was determined that blindness would not turn her son into a cripple, not in body, not in spirit. Aretha Robinson was a proud, fiercely independent woman who had already endured more hardship than most. She had been orphaned, then exploited and abandoned by Ray's father before Ray was even born. Life had made her steely, and she poured that strength into her son. One afternoon, shortly after Ray went completely blind, Aretha watched from the doorway as her 7-year-old stumbled across their cramped home, groping for a chair. Ray tripped over a rocking chair and fell hard on the wooden floor. "Mama!" he cried out, arms flailing in panic at the sudden, sightless pain. Aretha took a half step forward, instinct urging her to scoop him up, but she stopped herself. Biting her lip, she did not rush to her boy's side. She let him struggle. Ray's small hands patted the floor, searching for bearings. He sniffled, fighting sobs, and slowly pushed himself onto his knees. "Mama," he called again, voice trembling. Aretha stood silently, tears in her eyes, forcing herself not to answer. It took every ounce of her will. Finally, Ray wiped his nose on his sleeve, steeled himself, and rose unsteadily to his feet. He found the chair, fingers wrapping around its familiar shape. Only then did Aretha speak. "Good. You ain't hurt. Now you know, baby, you can find your own way." She stepped forward and pulled him into her arms, voice firm and soft at once. "You blind, but you ain't stupid," she whispered into his ear. "Don't you let nobody turn you into a cripple. You ain't no charity case, you hear me?" Ray nodded into his mother's shoulder. He heard her. He would never forget those words. From that day on, Aretha trained Ray to be self-sufficient in his darkness. She taught him how to sweep the yard and chop wood by feel, how to identify the bills in his pocket by folding the corners differently for ones, 5s, 10s. When neighbors offered pity, Aretha politely refused. "My boy's blind, yes," she would say, chin held high, "but he got a mind and 2 hands. He can do for himself." In the dusty, segregated hamlet of Greenville, Florida, little R.C., say, as she called him, became a familiar figure, the black blind boy who somehow never seemed lost. He ran and played with the other children, memorizing every tree root and fence post in town so well that he could race down dirt paths at full tilt, laughing as others gaped. At night, when loneliness and fear crept in, Ray turned to the only companion that never abandoned him sound. Lying on a pallet next to his mother, he would listen. The chorus of crickets chirping outside, the distant roll of a train on the tracks, the creak of the house's tin roof cooling under the stars, every noise painted a mental map of the world. And at the heart of that world was music. Greenville didn't have much, not electricity, not running water, but it had the Red Wing Cafe and its upright piano. Mr. Wiley Pittman, the cafe's owner, was a family friend who treated Ray like a grandson. From age 3, before he ever went blind, Ray had been drawn to that piano in the corner of Pittman's cafe. He'd stand on tiptoe, watching wide-eyed as Mr. Pittman's fingers danced out lively woogie tunes. Now, with eyes of no use, the boy clung to music more fiercely than ever. Mr. Pittman began teaching Ray simple tunes, letting the child's small hands feel out the keys. Ray was a quick study, uncannily quick. He couldn't see the keys, but he seemed to intuit where the right notes were. By age 7, Ray could play snatches of blues and gospel songs he'd heard on the radio or at church, picking out melodies by ear. When Mr. Pittman saw Ray's eagerness, he opened up the cafe during off hours just for him. In the silent afternoons, with dust motes drifting through the shafts of sunlight, Ray would sit at the piano bench, feet dangling, practicing scales and chords over and over until they became muscle memory. Outside, the other kids might be playing in the fields, but Ray was inside, eyes closed as are seeing or not made no difference now, swaying gently as his fingers found their way through a song. Music was becoming his new way of seeing. Every note was a color, every chord a shape, every rhythm a path forward. In 1937, Aretha managed to secure young Ray a place at the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind in St. Augustine. It was one of the few institutions that would accept a black blind child in the Deep South, a fact Aretha had fought for, calling in favors from anyone who would listen. She hated to send her son away, but she knew he needed skills she couldn't give. Ray, just 7 years old, initially protested leaving home. Greenville was all he knew, and the idea of a strange school terrified him. But Aretha knelt and held his hands, telling him firmly, "You will go and you will learn. Don't you let that sightless head of yours stay empty. Fill it with something." And so Ray went. The school was segregated. Black students were taught separately from white students, and the resources for a poor black boy were scant. Yet Ray thrived. He learned to read and write music in Braille under the patient guidance of a teacher named Mrs. Lawrence. It was painstaking work, reading Braille musical notation with one hand while learning to play the notes with the other. But Ray attacked it with relentless focus. His world was already tactile and auditory. Braille music was just another puzzle to solve by touch and sound. He spent hours mastering classical pieces by Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, composers a poor black child was not expected to care about, much less conquer. But he did. The discipline of classical music sharpened Ray's technical skills immensely. Still, when he played those stiff European compositions, he would sometimes slyly syncopate the rhythms or bend a note with bluesy flavor, earning a disapproving frown from his instructors. There was a restlessness in him, even then a need to feel the music, not just play the notes on the page. On Sundays, the school's chapel came alive with gospel hymns, and Ray's voice, rough-edged and plaintive, rang out louder than anyone's. Sacred music stirred something deep in him. He felt every word of those spirituals, even as he furtively imagined how that energy could jump the church walls and set the Saturday night dance halls on fire. Through all these years, Aretha remained Ray's anchor. He came home each summer, a little taller, a little more confident navigating the world without sight. Aretha's health, however, was fading. She kept this from Ray as best she could. One spring day in 1945, when Ray was just 14, a telegram arrived at the school. Aretha Robinson had died suddenly. The woman who had been Ray's whole world, his eyes, his guide, his protector, was gone. Ray felt the news like a second, cruel blindness. If darkness had a sound, it was the silence left in his mother's absence. At her funeral, Ray stood at the graveside, sightless eyes hidden behind the first pair of dark glasses he'd ever owned, and wept without restraint. The people of Greenville whispered that the boy's sorrow was too deep, that maybe a blind child shouldn't be left alone now. But Ray heard his mother's voice echo, "Don't let nobody turn you into a cripple." 2 days after the funeral, he made a decision. He told the school he would not be coming back. Education was all well and good, but it wouldn't put food on the table or music in his soul. He was on his own now, truly. It was time to make a living, time to test whether all those long, lonely practice hours could earn him respect beyond the confines of a charity school. With nothing but a few dollars, a portable vinyl record player, and the battered piano sheet music Braille books he'd accumulated, 15-year-old Ray Charles Robinson set off to find his future. He was blind, orphaned, and black in the Jim Crow South. The odds could not have been stacked higher against him. Yet as he boarded a segregated Greyhound bus, the boy pressed his face to the window, though he couldn't see the fields flying past, and allowed himself a small, determined smile. Let them doubt him. Let them dismiss him. He would find a way, his own way, or die trying. And so the journey began. On the Chitlin Circuit, rejection and revelation. In the late 1940s, Ray Charles hit the road with a suitcase and a hunger. He knocked around Florida first, playing any gig he could find on what musicians called the Chitlin Circuit, the network of black clubs, juke joints, and theaters across the segregated South where a black musician could perform, often for meager pay and a hot meal. In Jacksonville, he slept on a friend's floor and played piano at the Ritz Theater in the black neighborhood of La Villa for $4 a night. $4 a night, barely enough for a decent supper, but Ray played with gratitude. Each evening he'd slip behind the piano and become Ray Charles, the entertainer, hiding a shy boy behind a cocky grin and dark glasses. Locals started to whisper that the blind kid was something special. He could play pretty much anything, jazz standards, blues, even country tunes he'd picked up from the Grand Ole Opry broadcasts late at night. And he didn't just play, he performed, swaying with the music, cracking little jokes in a smooth patter like he'd heard Nat King Cole do on the radio. If you closed your eyes, you might think it was Nat Cole himself at the keys. In fact, Ray had so mastered Cole's urbane piano style and honeyed baritone that patrons would request those songs just to marvel at the imitation. It got him gigs, but inside, Ray felt torn. He adored Nat King Cole. Cole was a black man who had made it big by sounding refined and smooth, and Ray looked up to that. Yet playing copycat night after night left him feeling empty. He yearned to play music that was unmistakably his, but what choice did he have? An unknown blind teenager wasn't going to fill seats with experimental sounds. Club owners wanted what was popular and safe, so Ray obliged, smiling through the Nat Cole tributes while plotting his next move. The jobs didn't come fast enough to keep a roof over his head. By late 1946, Ray found himself in Orlando with pockets empty and stomach often hollow. He lived in borderline poverty, sometimes not eating for days when gigs dried up. More than once, he hungrily felt his way down back alleys after a show, searching dumpsters behind restaurants for a half-eaten sandwich or a bruised piece of fruit. But he refused to quit. To make ends meet, Ray played any party, any fish fry, any roadhouse that would have him. He even started writing musical arrangements for other bands, painstakingly working out horn parts and harmonies in Braille, then dictating them, since he couldn't write standard notation. By 16, he was scrappy and resourceful, leveraging every connection. It was around this time that Ray heard about Lucky Millender's band coming through Florida, leading to that fateful audition and crushing rejection at the start of our story. That could have been the end of Ray's ambitions, but instead it became a turning point. Stung by Millender's dismissal, Ray returned to gigging with renewed ferocity. He threw himself into practice, sometimes locking himself in a storage room with a piano for days. He'd run blues scales until his fingers ached, then switch to playing classical etudes from memory to refine his touch. Then challenge himself to mimic the lightning, fast solos of jazz pianist Art Tatum he heard on records. He was obsessed not just with proving Lucky Millender wrong, but with discovering how far his talent could really go. In the summer of 1947, gaunt from hunger but filled with determination, Ray scraped together enough money for a long-distance bus ticket. He had considered trying his luck in New York or Chicago, but those cities felt too big, too overwhelming to navigate blind and alone. Instead, he chose a place as far from the deep South as he could manage without getting lost: Seattle, Washington, the remote northwest corner of the country, famous for its thriving jazz scene and radio hits drifting down from Canada. Perhaps there, a blind pianist could find a niche. Ray boarded a Greyhound headed clear across the continent. A 3-day journey he spent fiddling with his old guitars, an instrument he barely knew, and humming new melodies to himself. Arriving in Seattle in 1948 was like landing on a different planet. The air was cool, the crowds on the street cosmopolitan and buzzing. Seattle's Jackson Street was alive with jazz clubs and teenage beboppers twisting to the latest records. Here, no one knew little Ray Charles Robinson, and his sad story and that anonymity gave Ray freedom. He quickly fell in with a couple of other young musicians, including a 15-year-old trumpet player and aspiring arranger named Quincy Jones. Quincy and Ray bonded instantly, two black kids far from home. Bursting with musical ideas and hungry for success, they'd jam in the basement of a Seattle club called the Rocking Chair. Quincy's brassy improvisations intertwining with Ray's bluesy piano riffs, both of them pushing each other to be better. Decades later, Quincy Jones would still marvel at how Ray, even as a teenager, could play everything, and had this uncanny sense of timing and musical structure that belied his age. Seattle is where Ray Charles truly began to become Ray Charles. He dropped his last name, Robinson, professionally to avoid confusion with the champion boxer Sugar Ray Robinson, and simply went by Ray Charles. Together with his friend Gossie McKee on guitar and Milton Guard on bass, he formed a trio, the Mixon Trio, a mash of McKee and Robinson. They got the graveyard 100 to 500 a.m. slot at the Rocking Chair Club. It wasn't glamorous. The crowd was often thin and half asleep or fully drunk by those hours. But Ray treated every set like it was Carnegie Hall. He'd growl out blues numbers, tackle fast jazz tunes, and throw in the Nat Cole style ballads to please the stragglers. Word spread among local musicians that this blind kid at the Rocking Chair had something special. One night in April 1949, after a particularly raucous late night jam, Ray and his trio went into a tiny studio and cut a song called Confession Blues. It was a smoky, smooth track, more cocktail lounge than juke joint with Ray's piano and voice leading the way. To everyone's surprise, Confession Blues started getting regional radio play and then charted on Billboard's national R&B chart, eventually reaching Fight 2. Ray Charles, at 18, suddenly had a hit record on his hands. He couldn't quite believe it. For years he'd been scraping by, hearing plenty of people tell him what he couldn't do, and now he had proof that he could. He'd tasted a bit of success. Yet, oddly, this triumph didn't immediately open all the doors he'd hoped. The music industry was still skeptical. After all, Confession Blues sounded a lot like something Charles Brown or Nat King Cole might have done. Was Ray Charles just a flash in the pan, an imitator who got lucky once? The question hung over him. Ray himself wondered who he truly was as an artist. He had shown he could play the game by the old rules. But inside him, something new and risky was percolating, born of all those influences churning in his head-eyed gospel hymns, jazz riffs, down, home blues, and even the twang of country music he'd soaked up as a child listening to the Opry. In Seattle's melting pot, Ray had begun to experiment in small ways during live shows. He'd slip a gospel-style call and response section into a blues song or play a holy rolling church chord progression under a love song's lyrics just to see how the late night crowd reacted. Often, they had no idea what he was doing, they just felt a sudden jolt of energy and didn't know why. Ray was testing the waters of something revolutionary without fully realizing it himself. By 1950, Ray's modest hits and growing reputation led him to Los Angeles, the center of the West Coast music scene. He toured as a pianist and arranger with blues guitarist Lowell Fulson, which was both a paycheck and a further education. On the road with Fulson's band, Ray experienced the harsh realities of touring as a blind black man in segregated America. They played black theaters in one city, then snuck into cheap motels by the back door in the next. Some restaurants refused to serve them at all. Ray learned to rely on his bandmates to guide him through unfamiliar towns, but he also developed an uncanny independence. He memorized the layout of every stage they played on after one walkthrough, so that during performances he could stride confidently from the piano to the mic stand without a second thought, never mind that he couldn't see the edge of the platform. Other musicians noted how fiercely self-reliant Ray was. He carried himself like a man who answered to no one, even when he needed an arm to get down the stairs. And every night after gigs, while others chased women or drank, Ray went back to his room with a braille notepad or a tape recorder to work on songwriting ideas. He was driven, possessed by music. He'd be up all night with that damn piano, one bandmate recalled years later, playing until we had to pull him away to get some sleep. Ray's obsessive honing of his craft was laying the groundwork for the breakthrough to come. But first, he needed the right opportunity, a place that would let Ray be Ray. That opportunity arrived in 1952, when Atlantic Records, a rising independent label known for cutting edge R&B, bought out Ray's contract from a small label for $200,500. The bosses at Atlantic, Ahmet Erdogan and Jerry Wexler, didn't see a blind imitator or novelty, they saw raw talent and were willing to nurture it. Ray moved to New York to record for Atlantic, and for the first time, he walked into a studio as an artist with creative freedom. Brother Ray finds his voice. Under Atlantic's wing, Ray Charles inched closer to the sound in his head that he couldn't yet fully articulate. The label didn't try to pigeonhole him, they let him experiment. In late 1953, he had a minor hit with an upbeat woogie number called Mess Around, and another with the playful It Should Have Been Me. These songs sold well enough in the black rhythm and blues market, but they were still somewhat conventional. Atlantic's producers noticed something, though, when Ray really sang. There was a grit in his voice and a freedom in his timing that set him apart from any smooth crooner. It was like he had a preacher's fervor even when delivering a secular love song. In the studio, Ray started loosening up. He'd urge the backing musicians to get down like we do in church, clapping on the off, beats and swaying as if the Holy Ghost might seize the room. In 1954, in the tiny studio Atlantic used in New York, Ray and his band cut a track that would change the course of American music. The song was called I've Got a Woman. It started innocently, a jaunty gospel, flavored riff on the piano, the kind you might hear on a Sunday morning, except it was a Saturday night in the lyrics and Ray was wailing about a woman's love rather than God's glory. "I've got a woman, way over town, that's good to me," he howled, voice dipping and soaring with abandon. The band behind him played like a sanctified church combo that had snuck into a roadhouse handclaps, shouted, "Alleluia," backgrounds, and a rhythm that bounced with pure joy. Ray's friend and trumpeter Renald Richard had helped pen the lyrics, but the soul of that song was all Ray. It was built on the melody of a gospel hymn. It must be Jesus. By the Southern tonans that Ray had heard and couldn't get out of his head. He basically took that sanctified tune and gave it secular words, turning Jesus into baby and transforming a line about salvation into a line about earthly love. It was risky, in fact, downright scandalous to anyone devout. But to Ray, it felt natural. Church music was part of him, and so were the blues. Joining them was like merging two halves of his soul. He later insisted it wasn't a calculated move to invent a new genre. He was just writing what felt good to him. Atlantic Records released "I've Got a Woman," and it promptly shot to #2 on the R&B chart in 1955. For many in the black community, this song was a revelation, gospel music's passion with the serial numbers filed off, repurposed into a joyous romp about romantic love. Young people loved it. Older folks weren't so sure. At first, mainstream white audiences hardly noticed this was still race music, marketed mainly to black radio. But within churches and certain circles, outrage was brewing. How dare this Ray Charles fellow take the Lord's music and use it to sing about a woman in that wild, hip-shaking way? Letters began to arrive at Atlantic's offices addressed to Ray. Some were fan letters praising his new sound, but others were venomous. Ray would recount later how he opened envelope after envelope accusing him of blasphemy and bastardizing God's work, condemning him for dragging sacred gospel into juke joints and making people dance to it. A famous bluesman of the older generation, Big Bill Bronzy, publicly chastised Ray as well. "He's mixing the blues with spirituals," Bronzy complained. "And I know that's wrong. He should be singing in church." Some black preachers inveighed against Ray by name in their Sunday sermons, denouncing that devil's music he was spreading. Ray heard the criticism, but he didn't apologize. In fact, he didn't even slow down. Inside, he understood why the church folk were upset. He had grown up with that strict divide between Saturday night sinning and Sunday morning repentance. But in Ray's mind, music was music. "I was keeping the feeling, just changing the lyrics," he told friends, shrugging at the idea that God would be offended. If anything, the controversy emboldened him. He realized that the fiery reaction meant he had struck a nerve, tapped into a power no one else had dared unleash. Rather than retreat, Ray Charles barreled forward, writing and arranging a string of hits that continued this fusion of the spiritual and the sensual. "This Little Girl of Mine," "Drown in My Own Tears," "Hallelujah, I Love Her So." Each one climbed the charts, and each one dripped with gospel emotion, even as Ray shouted and crooned about everyday heartache and love. By 1956, he had a whole congregation of fans testifying to his music, and not all of them were black. White teenagers tuning into the radio late at night found themselves captivated by the sound too, even if they didn't quite know what it was. The line between gospel, blues, and jazz had been breached, and soul music, though it didn't have a name, yet was being borne note by note every time Ray stepped up to a microphone. The more Ray innovated, the more the establishment bristled. Atlantic Records, to their credit, supported him. The label's founders saw that Ray's unorthodox blend was not only artistically exciting, but commercially potent. Not everyone in the industry was so farsighted. There were rumors that some executives at bigger record companies thought Ray's music was too volatile, that mixing sacred and secular might spark boycotts or just confuse the market. In 1957, Atlantic packaged some of Ray's singles into his first real album, and unsure how to brand this new sound, they simply labeled it rock and roll on the cover, trying to ride the new crazied. It wasn't quite rock and roll, though Ray Charles was something else, something that didn't even have a proper name yet. In segregated America, Even music was expected to stay in its lane. Gospel stayed in church, blues in the bar, pop on the white radio stations. But here was a black blind man gleefully trespassing across boundaries, whether he meant to or not. One by one, Ray was knocking down walls musical, racial, or otherwise, and the establishment grew nervous. Southern white radio stations were wary of playing his records. Not only were they by a black artist, but the ecstatic whoops and earthy lyrics of songs like "I Got a Woman" were seen as too sexually charged. Some stations flat outband Ray's more provocative tunes. When he released the Apache track, What I Say, in 1959, which climaxed with Ray and his female backing singer's moaning call, and response gibberish that sounded unmistakably like the throes of passion, a number of conservative stations refused to spin it, but that only fueled the song's mystique. Kids rushed to buy the record that their local DJ wouldn't play. What I Say rocketed up the charts, becoming Ray's first top 10 pop hit and a national sensation. Every night, Ray performed it as the closing number to packed concert halls, turning the venue into a frenzied revival meeting of dance and desire. The genie was out of the bottle. America had heard soul, and there was no one hearing it. Still, not everyone was clapping along. Across the country, some church leaders doubled down in condemning Ray's blending of the sacred and secular. In one famous incident, a Catholic archdiocese in the Northeast reportedly issued guidance to its parishioners warning them against the suggestive rhythms of certain race records, and though they didn't name names, everyone knew they meant Ray Charles and his ilk. But for each finger-wagging critic, there were thousands of young people, both black and white, who couldn't get enough of this liberating sound. After What I Say, which many now acknowledge as the first true soul song, Ray Charles's star was ascendant. The music industry couldn't ignore him any longer. He had transcended the race records category and was now a bona fide crossover star. In 1959, with his Atlantic contract expiring, a fierce bidding war erupted among major record labels to sign him. The same corporate gatekeepers who might have once dismissed Ray as an unpredictable blind R&B shouter were now practically begging for his signature. Ray had leverage, and he used it. He shocked the industry by signing with ABC Paramount on a deal that was almost unheard of at the time, not only a hefty advance, but a clause granting him artistic control and ownership of his master tapes after a certain period. A black artist in 1959 owning his own masters. It was revolutionary, the sort of contract even most white stars didn't get. ABC executives were taking a gamble, but Ray insisted on it, and he got his way. One can imagine the closed-door meetings. Some ABC higher-ups nervously wondering if they just handed the keys to the kingdom to a loose cannon who mingled with gospel and blues. What if his luck ran out? But Ray's luck, if one calls it that, was only just beginning. He had proven he could create hits on his own terms. Now, backed by the clout of a major label and given free rein, he was about to soar even higher and drag the establishment along with him, whether it liked it or not, shattering the boundaries and fears of American music. In November 1960, a year after joining ABC Records, Ray Charles sat at a grand piano in a New York studio, ready to record a curiously old-fashioned song. It was Georgia on My Mind, a wistful ballad from 1930 that had been a minor standard. Many in Ray's camp hadn't understood why he chose this tune of all things as his first big project with ABC. It was a far cry from the gritty, churchy soul that had made him famous. But Ray had a vision for Georgia. He slowed it down, way down, and let his voice caress each lyric with a tenderness and depth of feeling that was simply stunning. Lush strings swelled in the background, arranged by Sid Feller, one of the rare times Ray let someone else handle the arrangement, and a choir hummed gently along. When Ray sang, Georgia, Georgia, no peace I find, it was as if every ounce of longing in his heart poured into the microphone. This was not a song about a woman, or even really about the state of Georgia. It felt like a song about home, about yearning for acceptance. The recording captured something pure, something that transcended genre. When Georgia on My Mind was released, it conquered the charts. It hit Fate 1 on the pop chart in 1960 and earned Ray Charles 2 Grammy Awards at a time when the Grammys had barely acknowledged R&B artists. Middle America, which might have felt threatened by the frenetic ecstasy of What I Say, fell in love with the blind man's velvet, soul rendition of Georgia. Critics praised it. Radio stations played it incessantly. Ironically, the very state of Georgia where Ray had been born and which had treated him as a second-class citizen due to his race, would years later adopt Ray's version of the song as its official state song. The establishment's walls were not just cracking now, they were being repainted in Ray's colors. Flush with this mainstream triumph, Ray did something even bolder. If mixing gospel and R&B had once made the industry anxious, what he did next absolutely shocked them country music. In 1962, Ray Charles announced he wanted to record an album of country and western songs, but arranged and sung in his own soulful style. It was hard to overstate how strange this idea sounded at the time. Country music was seen as the domain of white rural Americans. Many country radio stations wouldn't dream of playing music by a black artist, and vice versa. The cultural divide was stark. The executives at ABC, Paramount were surely uneasy. Would the existing fans of Ray's R&B feel alienated? Would country fans riot at the idea of their classics being reinterpreted by a rhythm and blues singer with a gospel twang? But again, Ray's instincts proved visionary. He recorded modern sounds in country and western music, taking songs like I Can't Stop Loving You and You Don't Know Me, songs dripping with Nashville sentiment, and infusing them with rich arrangements, big band horns, strings, a touch of blues and gospel in his phrasing. The result was magical. The album was released in 1962 and promptly became a phenomenon. I Can't Stop Loving You hit Phase 1 on the pop charts for 5 weeks straight. The album itself went to high 1 and was one of the best-selling albums of the year. Suddenly, hard country fans and sophisticated jazz aficionados and teenage R&B lovers all found common ground in Ray's music. He had made the barriers between genres feel irrelevant, even silly. For the music industry suits, this was a moment of both joy and terror, joy at the cash pouring in, terror at the realization that Ray Charles was rewriting the rulebook by sheer force of talent. Everything the gatekeepers had feared, the mixing of audiences, the breaking of format rules was happening, and instead of collapsing, the business was booming because of it. The risk-averse powers that be realized that the riskiest thing of all might have been underestimating Ray Charles. Meanwhile, out on the road, Ray's touring success was also forcing change. In the segregated South, he had begun to refuse to play for segregated audiences. Famously, in 1961 in Augusta, Georgia, Ray learned that black fans at his show would be restricted to the balcony while whites got the floor. Ray flightly canceled the concert, even knowing he'd be sued for it. Indeed, he was sued and fined. A black man daring to break a contract over civil rights was practically unheard of. Georgia even banned him from performing in the state as a punitive measure. Yet Ray stood firm. 2 years later, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Ray returned to Georgia and performed at the same venue to an integrated audience. The very state that had penalized him would, as mentioned, later sing his praises officially. The institutions that tried to control or contain Ray, whether musical genre divisions or Jim Crow laws, ultimately found him uncontrollable. His success made him impossible to pigeonhole. He performed for presidents, and he jammed with jazz greats. He appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show for mainstream America and on Chitlin circuit reviews for his core base. By the mid-1960s, Ray Charles had become an institution in his own right. The industry might have initially been desperate to manage him, to make him fit their old models, but now it was they who scrambled to keep up. Other artists took note too. Sam Cooke, who had also come out of the church, had followed Ray's lead in going secular and became a soul pioneer himself. Young singers like Aretha Franklin, a preacher's daughter, saw that they could bring gospel fire into pop and R&B because Ray had kicked that door open. Even the world of rock and roll owed him. Elvis Presley idolized Ray and covered his songs, so did the Everly Brothers and Jerry Lee Lewis. When the Beatles were woodshedding in their early days, they played Ray Charles numbers in the clubs of Hamburg. The ripple effect of what Ray started was enormous. A reporter coined the term soul music around this time to describe the outpouring of emotionally charged black music that Ray and his contemporaries were making. And indeed it was the perfect word, soul. Ray had poured his soul, the soul of gospel's ecstasy and blues pain, into the framework of popular music. Now that soul was everywhere, changing the sound of the radio forever. Legacy, the genius who refused to be limited. In 1979, the legislature of Georgia, the same state where a promoter once sued Ray for standing against segregation, officially designated Ray Charles's rendition of Georgia, On My Mind, as the state song. On the day they honored him at the Georgia State Capitol, some of those straight, laced politicians looked downright emotional as Ray, now middle-aged and every bit the legend, sat at his piano and sang the tune with that familiar smile and sway. It was a moment thick with irony and quiet vindication. Decades earlier, they wouldn't even let him play to a mixed crowd. Now they were celebrating him. Ray's victory was never about a trophy or a title. It was in the transformation of attitudes and culture that he helped bring about simply by being himself. He had forced the world to accept a black man who didn't stay in one category, who blurred lines that weren't meant to be blurred, and he did it without ever delivering a grand manifesto or political speech. His weapon was always the music. By the 1980s and 1990s, Ray Charles was rightly venerated as the genius of soul. He amassed shelves of awards, 17 Grammys, the Kennedy Center Honors, induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, yet he remained disarmingly humble about his gifts. Frank Sinatra, no stranger to ego, called Ray Charles the only true genius in show business. Billy Joel said that, in his opinion, Ray was more important than Elvis Presley. Such praise might have embarrassed Ray. He often chuckled and shrugged off the word genius. Perhaps he remembered how, in the beginning, he was just a blind kid desperate to prove himself. He preferred when friends simply called him Brother Ray. It felt more human, more real. And brother was apt through his music. Ray Charles had become like family to millions, his voice a companion in their joyous moments and their heartaches. Ray's later years were not without struggles. He battled and overcame a heroin addiction that had plagued him through the 50s and 60s. He weathered changes in musical fashion that at times left him, like many pioneers, less in the spotlight. But by then it didn't matter if he had a current hit on the charts. The world knew who he was and what he had done. Long before his passing in 2004, Ray Charles's place in history was secure. He had seen the birth of rock and roll, the rise of soul, the integration of American music, and he had a hand in all of it. The genre that once didn't exist, soul music, was now the backbone of R&B and pop. Artists from Otis Redding to Stevie Wonder to Whitney Houston drew from the well Ray dug. Every time a singer pours raw feeling into a pop song, or a pianist blends gospel chords with a blues melody, Ray's spirit is there. His influence even extended beyond music into the culture at large, helping to erode some racial barriers. After all, it's hard to fear or hate a people whose music moves you at your core. Ray Charles, through the integrated soul of his art, quietly helped change hearts, and that's a legacy no award can fully capture. And what of those early doubters and cynics? What of the people who laughed at the blind boy, or sniffed that his merging of spiritual fervor with secular groove was vulgar? History has answered them. The novelty they thought they were witnessing turned out to be an era-defining innovator. The institutions that tried to tame him ended up toasting him. Perhaps somewhere, in some dusty archive, there's a transcript of Lucky Millinder years later, reminiscing about the kid he once turned away. Maybe he admitted that even he couldn't have seen what was coming. The world Ray Charles entered as a young man was not ready for him, but he didn't wait for permission to reshape it. He took the blindness, the pain, the gospel truth, the barrel house blues, and the jazz chops, and he swirled them into something so new and powerful that the world had to adapt. Ray never set out to be a rebel or a hero. He was simply being true to the sounds he heard in his head and heart. In doing so, he forced music forward and culture along with it, one passionate song at a time. In the final measure, Ray Charles stands as a testament that genius can bloom in the unlikeliest of places, a poor, sightless boy in the racist South, and upend the world's expectations. He turned laughter and doubt into fuel for innovation. He transformed personal sorrow into universal beauty. And he did it without sight but with an inner vision that saw structure where others heard chaos, a vision that recognized no partitions between genres or people. Today, we take for granted that gospel melisma spices up pop songs, that a soulful voice can belt out a country tune, that music is music, period. But there was a time not long ago when those lines were stark and seemingly immovable. Ray Charles erased those lines, not with a loud activist cry, but with a rhythm and a voice that refused to stay confined. The laughter of naysayers is long forgotten, drowned out by the enduring chorus of artists and fans inspired by Brother Ray. The world he changed plays on, its soundtrack rich with the soul he gifted it. Ray Charles is gone, but listen closely in every heartfelt riff, every bluesy wail, every gospel-influenced pop anthem, you can hear an echo of that blind boy from Florida. The boy they once laughed at has, long since had the last laugh, not a boisterous guffaw, but a soulful chuckle as he leans into the keys, knowing the music will speak for itself. In the end, Ray Charles didn't just invent soul music, he revealed the soul of music to all of us, and nothing has ever been the same.